Hey everybody, oops, let me get going here. Hey everybody, welcome to our next video. This video is actually going to deal with muscle twitches, and we'll talk about what a muscle twitch is in a moment. It's not the same thing as a spasm or the same thing as a cramp. How do muscles differ in their ability to respond to a stimulus, and what does exercise do to muscle, and what happens if we're not using our muscles too much, and then what happens in a muscle spasm. Where am I? Let me show up here. Hey. So let's look at what a muscle twitch is. Again, a muscle twitch is not like when you get a twitch or a tingling sensation in a particular muscle. That's a spasm, and we'll talk about that toward the end. But here we're talking about what happens to a single muscle fiber when you give it a stimulation. That is, if a nerve signal were to send a signal to a muscle fiber, what's going to happen when that signal gets there? Well, notice that we have three phases to a contraction cycle, if you will. We start off with this applying a stimulus here, and notice what happens when we do. There's going to be a short period of time, 1 or 2 milliseconds, when that muscle does not actually contract at all. We don't see any kind of increase in tension. This axis is showing you tension, so we don't see any increase. So what happens when we stimulate a muscle fiber before it begins to contract? And you already know the answer to this. That signal travels along the sarcolemma, it travels down the T-tubules, it causes the release of calcium from the sarcoplasmic reticulum. The calcium spills into the muscle fiber, and calcium goes and binds to troponin. So all that's going to happen in the course of this blue line in about 1 or 2 milliseconds. But again, notice that the muscle doesn't actually get tense, doesn't actually contract until over here. Then we have a period of time where, in roughly 15-20 milliseconds, where we do have that contraction. Myosin's grabbing actin and pulling. And then when there is no more stimulus for a contraction, then calcium is going to be actively transported back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, and then with no more calcium available, eventually we begin to have tropomyosin block those binding sites of myosin to actin, and the muscle relaxes. So there is this 3 phases: a lag phase or latent phase, a contraction phase, and a relaxation phase. Notice here in our time frame you see 40 milliseconds. That is, this muscle could go through a couple of hundred cycles of contracting and relaxing within a second. Way too fast for us to perceive, and there's other factors involved here too that we'll touch on in a second, like ATP. But this gives you an overall general view of what a muscle twitch is. That is the single response of a single muscle fiber following stimulation. But it does bring us to this question. When you look at a muscle twitch, you see this one's drawn out a little bit longer for you. We still have a latent period or lag period, a period of contraction, and then this relaxation phase. And notice how this one has a rather elongated relaxation phase. When you compare 3 specific muscles, the lateral rectus, okay, that's your eye, it's an extraocular muscle, it's on the sides of your eyes. The gastrocnemius and the soleus, which you know are going to be in the lower leg, notice how they each have that latent period, the contraction, the up, if you will, of the graph, and then some of them we're going to see, we're going to see in this case, differences in the relaxation phase. And let's see if it makes sense why. The soleus and the gastrocnemius are weight-bearing muscles, right? You're going to use those when you walk, and we don't need to have them immediately contract and then immediately relax. That relaxation phase can take, a couple hundred milliseconds, and we would be just fine. If you had the same kind of speed of contracting and relaxation that you associate with the eyes, you would not have that rapid eye movement that we associate with our eyes. So if you can get the contraction and relaxation periods done very quickly, you can have the next contraction and relaxation phase. So different muscles are going to differ in how long that relaxation phase is, and therefore have different physiologic responses. That brings us then to this particular point, which is when we look at our muscle fibers, not all of them are going to twitch at the same speed. And really the difference comes down to how quickly are we going to break that ATP myosin connection, or better said, myosin's bound to actin, right? ATP is required to break the connection. How fast does that happen? It depends upon the physiology of that muscle fiber, the enzymes that are in it, ATP, and some other factors. And we won't get too detailed here. You've probably heard of slow twitch and fast twitch muscle fibers before. There's actually a few different kinds, but we're going to keep it to just slow twitch and fast twitch for now. So let's do a basic comparison. Slow twitch fibers are going to be those fibers which can go through lots of contraction cycles. They resist fatigue. They have a whole bunch of mitochondria. They have a very robust blood supply. They need a lot of blood, a lot of oxygen. They are going to go through a very slow, deliberate period, or process rather, of producing ATP, which produces these slower twitch cycles of contraction. You're also going to see a lot of myoglobin. Myoglobin is a pigment. It's a reddish pigment that actually helps bind and store oxygen. So when you look at some muscle and it appears to be red, that muscle contains a lot of myoglobin. It's going to be a lot of slow twitch muscle. And we associate that muscle type primarily with marathoners. They can run for a long time. And it's because they have muscles that are going through this very slow, deliberate contraction relaxation cycle, but they are using ATP very efficiently, and as a result they can go through a long period of time of having contraction and not having fatigue. And we'll discuss fatigue more in class. Compare that to fast twitch fibers. These are fibers that are going to be able to break those ATP myosin connections a lot more quickly, but they fatigue more quickly too. So we're not going to be depending upon slow aerobic kinds of respiration, not the same kind of chemical processes we associate with slow twitch fibers. This is going to be fast and hot. So we're not going to have a lot of mitochondria because we're not producing a lot of ATP here. We don't worry about a lot of blood supply here because we don't need a lot of oxygen. This is going to be anaerobic for the most part. So it's also not going to need myoglobin storing a lot of oxygen. So this is the kind of explosive, quick, fast, but highly fatigued muscle association that we think about for sprinters. Sprinters can't run marathons very well. Marathoners can't run sprints very well. When we think about what humans have, though, the average human, which you probably have in your legs, you probably have roughly the same mix of slow twitch and fast twitch fibers, roughly 50-50. Now, you could have some genetic differences that make you more inclined to have more slow twitch or more fast twitch muscle fibers. And when we think about athletes such as these gentlemen over here, he probably has a large proportion of slow twitch fibers, and then training just made those better. He was probably born with a high proportion of fast twitch fibers. Training made that better. So there can be some genetic differences, but again, he could not go over and run the same race as this guy could with his fast twitch fibers in this long race. He could not run the same race as this guy and be quite as efficient and as effective. And training, though, even though training can make your fibers more efficient, it doesn't cause them to convert from one kind to the other. This guy can't make his slow twitch fibers become fast twitch fibers. He can make his slow twitch fibers more effective, but he can't switch types, and it goes the other way as well. So again, what are we talking about when we're talking about twitching and fiber speed? It's the speed at which the enzymes can help make these connections and break the connections within the muscle, so we have more or fewer contraction cycles. Now, the same is true if you think about, well, again, humans have them mixed together, but you've probably heard of dark meat and light meat, right? We're talking about turkeys, white meat and dark meat rather. The dark meat is going to be slow twitch. It's going to be reddish, and it's going to be because there's a lot of myoglobin we associate. So birds tend to have them quite distinct. They have their slow twitch one place and their fast twitch somewhere else. So the white meat, again, in turkeys would be mainly fast twitch fibers. And you can see these differences if you look at stains of muscle fibers. You see the slow twitch here being higher in myoglobin, and the kind of the pinker ones around it are going to be fast twitch because they're going to have less myoglobin and they're not requiring oxygen as their main energy source, the main way they're producing their energy rather. And we'll talk about that more in class. But the fast twitch fibers are using a different kind of energy pathway, an anaerobic pathway, and therefore they don't need oxygen the same way the slow twitch does. And as I mentioned before, there are slow oxidative, fast oxidative, and fast glycolytic. There's different ways that we can classify these. We're sticking with just slow and fast. So the last couple of things I want to mention here is how does exercise or lack of exercise affect muscles? And here we get into some pretty controversial topics with bodybuilders and the like. But think about this. If we want to make muscles more efficient, what kind of exercise do we want to be doing? We want to do exercise that's going to be aerobic. We want to increase blood supply. We want to make our muscles work better. So when you're thinking about exercising, like walking, for example, walking will train your muscles to use oxygen better, make them more efficient, and therefore aerobic exercise is what you want to focus on to make muscles more efficient. If you want to make muscles larger, you tend to need to do resistance exercise, lifting weights, you're using bands, you're using your own body weight. But here's where it gets a bit controversial, because there's not a lot of agreement among physiologists and the weightlifting community about this idea. I have here not by adding blank, but by adding blank. The fill-ins here is to make muscles larger, you're not adding muscle fiber. That is, you're not adding muscle cells, but you're probably adding myofibrils or you're adding muscle volume. So it's not that you're adding more cells, but you're making the cells you have bigger. This is where it gets a little controversial. There is a term you might see called sarcoplasmic hypertrophy, which is, it's possible some people exercising by lifting weights will not develop a lot more muscle strength, but they'll develop more muscle volume. They'll have more glycogen stored in their muscles, they'll increase their muscle volume, and hypertrophy means to get bigger. So they'll get bigger without getting a lot stronger. Myofibrillar hypertrophy is that you actually may add myofibrils, that is, actin and myosin protein units within your muscle if you're doing resistance exercise. What you're seeing over here, and please don't stress about this too much, but you have over here a resting myofibril. If you do some myotrauma, that is, you go and you lift weights really hard, you may actually develop some slight myotrauma in your myofibrils. Satellite cells are cells that are kind of right around muscle fibers. They may respond to this exercise you just did, this myotrauma, by actually fusing, as you see here. And by fusing, they may actually also, once they fuse, help generate more myofibrils, that is, more actin and myosin units, and that might be why you develop larger muscles and, of course, more strength. So again, it's controversial because you'll hear weightlifters all the time saying that they're adding muscle cells and muscle fiber. We really don't think that's true, but they are adding probably either muscle volume, either through glycogen and other volume, increasing the blood supply, for example, or they are adding myofibrils, that is, proteins within their muscle fibers, but not adding muscle fibers themselves. A little confusing, but that's where we are right now in that debate. The opposite, though, has to be considered as well. What happens if somebody is not using muscle? And you can develop muscle atrophy. So here's a normal biceps brachii, and when I get out of the way, you see how this muscle fiber has lost some mass. Why does that happen? Sarcopenia refers to loss of muscle mass. That's another term for this. So what can cause us to lose muscle mass? It's similar, if you will, if you think about this, to bone mass. If you are putting stress on bone, you build bone. If you're not stressing bone, then you don't, and in fact you can lose it. If you're not stressing muscles, muscles can lose both volume and can eventually lose myofibrils, and you can damage muscle to the extent that you really can't regenerate that muscle very much. The two main mechanisms by which you tend to lose muscle mass is disease atrophy and denervation atrophy. Disease atrophy is something like when you break a leg. The broken leg is a disease. When you're not using that body part, you're not using that leg, the muscle mass is slowly going to be broken down. And so the disease here is not using it leads to atrophy. The other side to that could be denervation atrophy. If you denervate, then you are cutting off the nerve stimulation to that muscle. If nerves aren't sending signals to that muscle, the muscle doesn't know to contract, and gradually that muscle will also lose mass for the same reason. It's not being stimulated, and therefore it's going to lose mass. So muscle atrophy basically means we're not using it. It could be because of a disease process, or it could be because of a denervation process. In either event, we're going to lose muscle mass over time, and I'm trying to show that here in this picture. It didn't really come out that great, but what I want you to focus on here is the process for building muscle is to use it. The process for breaking muscle down is to not use it. And finally, I want to touch on this one topic because it does tend to confuse people when we're talking about cramps and spasms, and they want to think about those as twitches, and they're not. But when we're talking about a muscle spasm or a muscle cramp, what are we talking about? Usually it's a sudden involuntary contraction. You don't mean to have it happen, but all of a sudden a muscle is going through a spasm or it's cramping up. And some people are quite prone to these, and other people rarely get them. But you see that typical causes. If someone is exercising or doing a lot of physical labor, particularly when it's hot, they're going to lose a lot of water. And so dehydration is probably responsible for a lot of muscle cramps. Why would dehydration matter? Well, it could be there has to be a certain balance of water in the muscles. Remember, muscles are quite watery, and if you lose a lot of water, then you may be interfering with the physiological processes. Why cramping is going to occur is, again, somewhat of a mystery, but we do associate cramping with overuse of muscles, dehydration, muscle strain. That is, muscles are working. You don't just at your sitting still sometimes develop a hard muscle cramp. You may develop a spasm in it, but it's not going to be probably of the intensity of a dehydration cramp. Some of these, again, are indications of other underlying conditions. Someone could have an issue where they have a mineral deficiency, and because of the imbalance of ions in their muscles, that might be why they're developing cramps. And you've heard of people saying to eat more bananas and get your potassium, and that's supposed to help. It can help some kinds of cramps for sure, but also the cramping could be due to nerve issues. It could be due to a blood supply issue, and that might be why someone is developing these spasms. But the spasms themselves and the cramps themselves are generally harmless, yet they could indicate some underlying condition that might be checked. So if you get cramps and spasms a lot, then certainly there's some tests to be done there. That does it for this video. Thank you very much.